I want to tell you a story about a woman by the name of Caster Semenya. Semenya is a South African Olympic double gold medalist, both for 800 meters. She won her first Olympic gold medal in 2012 and the other in 2016. But her sporting career started much earlier than that. She went on to win the World Junior Championship 800 meter in 2008 and the African Junior Championship 800 and 1500 meter in 2009. Her time, however, is not without its problems. Following a race that took place on the 26th of July in 2009, Caster Semenya's sex was drawn into question. She not only set that year's record, but had beaten her previous time by more than 5 seconds. What followed was a thoroughly dehumanizing farce known as sex verification, demanded by the International Association of Athletics Federations, also known as the IAAF. Now I should note at this point, Caster Semenya is a cisgender woman. Some of you thought I was going somewhere different with that story. For those of you who may be new to this channel, cis or cisgender is the scientific term for someone who identifies with their birth-assigned gender, the opposite of transgender, if you will. Now there has been some speculation as to whether Caster Semenya is intersex, a label which refers to someone with atypical sex development, meaning that while Semenya has correctly always been viewed and treated as a woman, she may have an atypical configuration of sexual characteristics, such as increased levels of testosterone. Now on the 1st of November of 2018, the IAAF implemented a new policy which seemed to have been designed to specifically target people such as Caster Semenya. This prompted investigation by the United Nations Human Rights Council in its 40th session. Said session took place between the 25th of February and the 22nd of March 2019. And in their article titled Elimination or Discrimination Against Women and Girls in Sport, they had the following concern. Quote, "The eligibility requirements for the female classification published by the International Association of Athletics Federations that came into effect on the 1st of November 2018 are not compatible with international human rights norms and standards, including the rights of women with differences of sex development, and concerned at the absence of legitimate and justifiable evidence for the regulations to the extent that they may not be reasonable and objective, and that there is no clear relationship or proportionality between the aim of the regulations and the proposed measures and their impact." End quote. The article then goes on to discuss the multitude of factors associated with athletic success before listing the rights violated by the IAAS guidelines. Said rights include the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the right to sexual and reproductive health, the right to work and to the enjoyment of just and favourable conditions of work, the right to privacy, the right to freedom from torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment and harmful practices, and full respect for the dignity, bodily integrity and bodily autonomy of the person. The United Nations Human Rights Council finishes by condemning both the practices of sex verification and enforced testosterone reduction in women. Now, why am I talking about the sporting rights of cisgender women in a video which is hopefully rather clearly about transgender athletes? Emphasis on trans women? Well, before we continue to discuss the subject of trans women competing in female sports and their rights in that regard, I think we should ground that understanding in the rights of cis women. After all, said rights do not change. They are the same for both cis and trans women. Of course, this opens discussion about whether arguments to exclude trans women, HRT or not, from sports can ever be upheld. But in spite of my own thoughts on that and how they align with what the United Nations Human Rights Council had to say on cis women's rights, there's still a discussion to be had, if for nothing else to clear up misconceptions. Misconceptions used to spin narratives such as these.
And I'm convinced that unless quickly rectified, this will kill women's sport. I don't want to see the day when women's athletics is dominated by Y chromosomes, but without a change in policy, that is precisely what's going to happen.
Oh dearie me, the ultralight man is here to teach us about his fears for women's sports. So what says he? What beckons the end of athletic womanhood? Of course, Stephen Woodford from Rationality Rules is jumping on the anti-trans bandwagon. Because when the Bible thumpers are too busy to blame us for every natural disaster on this planet, the trademark skeptics step up to claim that we're destroying Western civilization, piece by piece. And I get that some people may feel that I'm being a teensy bit unfair here, but how else am I supposed to respond to such alarmist rhetoric? People who have never been concerned about women's struggles all of a sudden taking up the pussy hat at the whiff of a far-right paycheck amuse me. Because Woodford's personal beliefs aside, that is who he caters to these days with his soft on Shapiro videos.
Love him or loathe him, I'm sure you'll agree with me when I say that Ben Shapiro is one of the greatest debaters around. He's intelligent, quick-witted, excellent at avoiding distractions, is amply armed with references, and, of course, he wields some fantastic one-liners. And yet, despite Ben's prowess, I disagree with him on almost every major issue. Sure, I'm with him when he's dispensing unrehearsed emotional college students who embody the regressive left.
I'm not denying your humanity if you're a transgender person. I am saying that you are not the sex to which you claim to be.
No dear, he's not good at avoiding distraction. Ben Shapiro is 100% distraction. He's a motor mouth of pure assertion. The prince of saying it with conviction means it must be true. That's all his one-liners ever really amount to. Sound bites to which the truly deplorable clap along and call him a genius. But enough about Shapiro. We're here for you. Let's see what sort of evidence you forward, starting with what is for many people the core of the issue. The science.
The main argument offered, and the one that's referenced by institutions such as the Olympics, Commonwealth, and UCI Masters, is the assertion that what gives a man advantage over a woman is exclusively their recent levels of testosterone.
They say that you male to female transgender, that you need to have been doing hormone therapy for at least a year because the testosterone levels, they think, at that level need to come down to make it more even, because a lot of testosterone that's where guys get their big muscles from, and they get their that's where you get it from.
So when a transgender woman competes, an important thing to realize is that she may be the same size as she was because of going through a male puberty. Her muscle mass has shrunk to female proportions.
To be clear, the IOC rules say that transgender women can only compete in women's sports after they have gone through a year of low testosterone due to hormone therapy. And that actually changes many biological characteristics, and especially those characteristics that are important for sport.
So there's the primary argument given, and again, it's endorsed by countless sport and athletic institutions. The IOC, for example, has ruled that transsexual women can compete as women so long as they identify as one and their levels of testosterone are under 10 nanomoles per litre, which, for the record, is still over double the average of a biological woman.
Great, and how does that apply to trans women and their testosterone levels? Woodford seems to be taking it as a given that since these are the limits for sport, that most trans women in sport will aim to sit on the very edge of said limit. But how does that relate to reality? According to the guidelines put out by the International Planned Parenthood Federation, anti-androgens, also known as testosterone blockers, should be used to reduce the rates of testosterone in trans women's bodies to somewhere between 30 to 100 nanograms per deciliter, just above 3 nanomoles per litre, the typical range for a cis woman. However, the IPPS range is much higher than many of the other ranges out there. Note, some of these numbers come in nanograms by deciliter, while some come in nanomoles per litre. So I will have to do some conversion for the section. I believe I'm using the same converter as Woodford, and all the pages I used will be referenced clearly in the description, just in case you'd like to check my numbers. But with that noted, shall we continue? The NHS guidelines range testosterone targets between 1 and 3 nanomoles per litre, far less than the 10 nanomoles described in the IOC's limit. 1 nanomole testosterone per litre comes to around 28 nanograms per deciliter, whilst 3 nanomoles per litre comes to just shy of 87 nanograms per deciliter, all of which fall well within the normal levels of testosterone for cis women, at least according to the NHS as of 2018. Overseas, meanwhile, the targets are even lower. According to Fenway Health in Boston, Massachusetts, doctors should be aiming for levels of testosterone of 55 nanograms per deciliter or less. Similarly, the Endocrine Society suggests a target of 50 nanograms per deciliter or less, and Vancouver Coastal Health goes as far as to suggest a target of 45 nanograms per deciliter or less, none of which come anywhere near the 288 nanograms per deciliter, the 10 nanomoles per litre that Woodford is crying about. In fact, many of these suggested targets cap trans women's testosterone levels at the lower end of a typical range for cis women. So if anyone is at a sporting disadvantage in regard to testosterone, it's most of trans women on HRT, at least within the UK, the US, and Canada. There's also another trick at play here. By focusing on the typical range of testosterone whilst discussing national and international level sports, you are implicitly claiming that women at such sporting events as the Olympics are representative of the typical woman. Meanwhile, the IAAF openly notes that, quote, "We have seen in a decade and more of research that 7.1 in every 1,000 elite female athletes in our sports have elevated testosterone levels. The majority are in the restricted events covered by these regulations," Berman said. This is around 140 times what you will find in the general female population, which demonstrates to us, in statistical terms, a recruitment bias, end quote. Note the way that even the IAAF doesn't claim that all of said women compete in the restricted events. That's because a number of said cases go completely unnoticed, allowing them to go on to compete unhindered. But putting the extreme outliers to one side for a moment, this selection bias is going to operate at a much smaller level as well. Whilst there are many cis women with levels of testosterone above the IOC limit, there will also be many who have more testosterone than your average cis woman, but within the IOC limit, and have had such their entire lives, including during puberty. The Olympics and similar national and international level sports are not a children's gym class. They are the pinnacle of human capability. They are going to attract the outliers, not the typical range, as you insinuate in your argument. So not only is Woodford's point here completely irrelevant to trans women on HRT, it actively harms cis women. It acts as the basis upon which their rights listed at the start of the video are violated. So concerned for cis women and women's sports are the people who make this argument that they're willing to steamroll the rights of cis women in said women's sports, just as a means to attack trans women and their place in public. And I get that Woodford claims,
this debate, this video, is about women's sport and what constitutes fair competition. It's not about whether or not transgender people should be allowed to use certain bathrooms, or if they should be able to join gender-specific non-competitive clubs, etc.
In this he attempts to soften the impact of what he's arguing. He seems to be claiming that discrimination in sports isn't a problem so long as trans people have access to these other spaces. However, one of the things the United Nations Human Rights Council recognized in its discussion was, quote, "The potential value of sport as a universal language that contributes to educating people on values of respect, dignity, diversity, equality, tolerance, and fairness as a means to combat all forms of discrimination and to promote social inclusion for all," end quote. So to be absolutely clear, Woodford does not have this defense to back him up. Sports participation, and by proxy, who does and who doesn't get to compete, has an impact. Therefore, attacking said participation is just one more way for the willfully ignorant to dehumanize both trans and cis women. But let's move on to the rest of his evidence.
But let's put this fact aside and still man the argument. Proponents assert that if a transgender woman has equal or lower levels of testosterone than the average biological woman, then they have no advantage.
You hear the critics that say being born male, Fallon, gives you a physical advantage over a female competitor. So that's, in your opinion, is not true.
Yeah, it's not just my opinion, that's the medical community's opinion. My testosterone levels are actually lower than any female that I've ever seen.
So bottom line, being born male doesn't give you a physical advantage competing in female MMA?
No, not at all. I'm actually at a disadvantage.
Now, if I'm honest, I don't just find this argument flawed, I find it utterly ridiculous. To steal an analogy from a friend, saying that transgender women should be able to compete against women so long as they identify as one and have testosterone levels lower than one is like saying that a Formula 1 car should be able to compete as a superbike so long as it identifies as one and has less fuel than one.
And David Coulthard takes the checkered flag, completing his 4 laps, 13 seconds quicker than Guy completed 3.
Now, of course, this analogy isn't perfect, since testosterone plays a bigger role in athletics than does fuel capacity in motorsport.
That analogy isn't just not perfect, it's completely and utterly fucked. To get anywhere close, you'd have to replace most of the engine with parts from a superbike, to the point that if you took it out and inspected it, the vast majority of its components would be bike components, since that's what HRT does to trans women. It reduces muscle mass, bone density, and hemoglobin count, whilst also increasing body fat. Now, does it erase everything? No. But to even argue that this is somehow relevant, Woodford needs to do 3 things. First, he needs to show which of these traits survive the HRT process and to which degree. Second, he needs to demonstrate superior performance on part of trans women on HRT. Third, he needs to demonstrate a causal relation leading from point 1 to point 2. Without that, he has nothing. Now, I'd like to note something about the setup for Woodford's next point as he's about to go on to make his big reveal. This section has very specifically been set up to counter the point that trans women on HRT lack advantage over cis women due to the effects of anti-androgens over time. To be absolutely clear, we are talking about trans women on HRT. So watch what happens when Woodford goes on to try and evidence his claims.
But the point is that recent levels of testosterone isn't the be-all and end-all. Compared to a superbike, a Formula 1 car has much better traction, is more aerodynamic, has a lower centre of gravity, and has a significantly bigger engine. Just as compared to a woman, a man, on average, has more hemoglobin in their blood, a significantly bigger heart, more lung capacity, greater bone density, less fat, a more advantageous distribution of their fat, a faster metabolic rate, and significantly more fast-twitch muscle fibres.
Did you spot the trick at play? Woodford utilised a basic bait and switch. He invited us to discuss the counter that trans women on HRT don't have an advantage due to said HRT. That was what he advertised. He then went on to assert that many of said traits remain in spite of HRT. That's when the switch took place. Instead of referencing articles on the differences between cis women and trans women who have undergone HRT, Woodford goes on to roll out articles discussing the differences between cis women and cis men, not one of which actually compares trans women on HRT to cis women, as would be relevant to the argument Woodford is pretending to address and is therefore necessary. Don't get me wrong, it's not all that's necessary since he still have to demonstrate trans women outperforming cis women and a causal relation, but it'd be a start at least. Currently, Woodford is attempting to pass off his half-baked hypothesis as being something worthy of being a conclusion, but the evidence doesn't just not support him, it actively contradicts him in many areas. Trans women actively lose muscle mass. Note the word mass as opposed to size, meaning it's not just quantity but density and composition that is also affected. They also gain extra fat deposits, typically as much as 38%, especially in areas such as the hips and buttocks. As for their metabolic rate, heart size and lung size, I don't know the impact of HRT on these things. I know that metabolism is affected, but whether these changes to the body's internal chemistry impact the metabolic rate is not clear. Likewise, the heart is a muscle. Therefore, it's not unfair to consider said muscle could change with HRT. But that's just a possibility worth looking into. I'm not forwarding it as evidence to base a conclusion on. I should also note that whilst bone demineralization does occur with HRT, a mixture of estrogen and exercise can prevent it following testosterone withdrawal. This, of course, is more likely in a sample being discussed. However, the fact that you claim that muscle structure and fat distribution remain constant regardless of HRT is alarming. The impact of anti-androgens on these physical attributes is well known, something the most rudimentary glance at the research on the topic should have shown you. Therefore, your ignorance of these facts does seem to suggest a lack of research, or worse, active omittance on your part. As for the rates of these changes in relation to cis women, I don't know and I don't really care. I'm not the one arguing for discrimination on grounds of unfair advantage. That's Woodford's position, one he needs to demonstrate in a causative fashion to even begin making his argument. There are many traits involved with athletic performance, therefore to hunt for the one or two traits which don't change or only partially do and claim that to be grounds for discrimination, that's a position lacking merit. Now, the observant of you out there may have noticed that I missed one, namely hemoglobin count. The reason I've not yet discussed this is because Woodford is about to launch his last-ditch attempt to convince you that these differences between cis women and cis men are not only present between cis women and trans women, but offer trans women a clear advantage. But before that, we need to set Rogan straight.
Or as Joe Rogan eloquently puts it,
it's like, do you know a woman who's got a hand that looks like that?
Yeah.
Find one. Because if I took estrogen, I'd still have these.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not fair.
Yeah.
It's just not. I don't care. I don't care what anybody says.
To answer Rogan's poorly thought out question, yes, I've seen many cis women with hands like that. I've also watched for years as various cis women, Michelle Obama in particular, have been attacked by the far right in a shitstorm that is as misogynistic as it is transphobic, thanks entirely to rhetoric you are now using as an argument against trans women. Many cis women have large hands. It's really not that abnormal. Likewise, plenty of cis women are taller than most cis men. For record, my mum is taller than my father and is where I get my height from. That's a reality I grew up with. But this toxic notion of femininity and by proxy feminine beauty as petiteness is dangerous at times. It's a sort of rhetoric that got us foot binding, a thoroughly repugnant practice. So the very idea that this could be classed as eloquent brings into question Woodford's judgment. But assessing the underlying point itself, bigger isn't always better. That is especially true considering that muscle mass deteriorates once a trans woman is put on HRT. Having a greater bone mass to muscle mass ratio could inadvertently lessen their physical prowess compared to a cis woman of equal muscle mass, especially when considering factors like air resistance and forces as pounds per square inch. We also have to remember the square cube law. Actually adapting your analogy into something which works, if you put a bike engine in a car, the car's chassis will be more of a hindrance than an advantage. That's in spite of the fact that it still has some of the traits superior to the bike, such as the lower profile. To clarify, I'm not saying that this is the case with trans women on HRT, but the presupposition that larger bodies benefits trans athletes is just that, a presupposition in need of evidence to back it up.
Now I could continue on this for hours, but for the sake of brevity, I'll keep things short by emphasising just one of the advantages that men have over women. When asked why men outperform women in most athletic events, Jamie Pringle, a physiologist who's trained many Olympic champions, said the following. The most consistent observation about the difference is that women have lower total mass of hemoglobin in their blood compared to men, and less blood in total. This means less capacity to transport oxygen in the blood, which, when combined with the heart's ability to pump that blood and the muscles' capacity to extract the oxygen from it, is a key determinant of aerobic fitness and endurance. And so, the assertion that reducing a transgender woman's testosterone to that of the average biological woman will create a level playing field is objectively, scientifically, bogus. If Joe was to reduce his testosterone, he would still have his enormous hands, just as Rachel still has a small pelvis and Laurel still has a large number of fast-twitch muscle fibers.
Did you get that, you unrehearsed emotional college students? Hemoglobin is the #1 advantage cis men have over cis women, and as we all know, blood doesn't change. You're born with the very blood you'll die with. So there's absolutely no chance that said hemoglobin count could lessen with HRT. Trans women have an unfair advantage, and that's the science. Well, this is awkward. You see, this is what happens when you attempt a bait and switch, using studies comparing cis women to cis men, rather than cis women to trans women on HRT. You end up talking a load of pure bollocks about hemoglobin being the greatest source of trans woman advantage, only to then discover that hemoglobin counts of trans women are the same as those of cis women. And whilst I don't expect everyone to know the science on this since it's such a niche subject, the fact that blood is regularly replaced and lessening testosterone in the elderly can lead to anemia, all of that should have been a red flag. Hell, that's where I first went when I was planning my basic structure. I was actually sent the study by fellow YouTuber Mrs. Snarky, wife to fellow trans atheist Maddie, and co-host of the Objectively Subjective YouTube channel. Be sure to check them out and pass on my thanks. But this also ignores the fact that Woodford is presenting himself as a well-researched position. After all, he says he could go on forever. About what, we'll never know. But perhaps researching the actual differences, or perhaps more accurately in many cases, similarities between trans and cis women, would be a start. Fact is, there is evidence out there. One review carried out in sports medicine looked at 8 research papers and reviewed 31 sporting policies related to the subject. What they found was, quote, "There is no direct and consistent research to suggest that transgender female individuals and transgender male individuals have an athletic advantage in sport, and therefore the majority of competitive sports policies are discriminatory against this population." End quote. So you do not have the science on your side like you pretend. And considering this...
Now, if you think I'm wrong on this topic and have a better argument than those just covered, then please do let me know, as if I'm wrong, I want to know it.
I expect you to make your errors clearly known to all who subscribe to your channel. You failed to carry out due diligence in regards to the science. You made a number of schoolboy errors, and as a result, many of the transphobic elements of your audience are going to feel emboldened. They're going to ramp up the abuse on people like me because of your failure. So I expect you to have the decency to do the right thing. Prove me wrong on the alt-like remark. Prove to me that you are better than that, because from watching the rest of your video, I really question that. A lot of what is said is not just factually wrong, it's unnecessarily hostile and dehumanizing towards trans people. Something I'll go on to discuss in a minute. But first I just wanted to note something that popped into my mind as I read the article on anemia in the elderly. The age at which the hemoglobin levels in cis men and cis women begin to diverge is 13. And indeed, this is the age where many of the traits Woodford lists do such. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because puberty blockers are used to prevent said changes in trans teenagers. So far, the entire conversation has not only focused solely on trans women, but specifically trans women of a certain history. Those who went through adolescent puberty, came out and began medically transitioning. But this isn't the only path for trans women. Many never went through said puberty, never had their major growth spurts, etc. They never had an advantage over cis women. And they need to be a part of this conversation as well. Yes, there will likely always be trans women who only came out later on in life, as well as many who don't feel so dysphoric as to need HRT. And we can discuss them in relation to what the United Nations Human Rights Council had to say about cis women with differences of sex development. But I just wanted to note that many trans women, more and more of each year, will never have had such advantage. Ever. So now that the science is out of the way, it's time to turn our focus to the more social aspects. Both the way in which Woodford presents the subject, as well as the case studies he utilises to offer his argument a sense of grounding. And to do that, I like to go back to the start to look at the 3 cases he launches with.
In a nutshell, I find the arguments and logic that currently permit transgender women to compete against biological women to be remarkably flawed, and I'm convinced that unless quickly rectified, this will kill women's sport. The transgender woman Rachel McKinnon is the UCI Masters Track Championships Women's 35 to 44 Sprint Gold Medalist. The transgender woman Laurel Hubbard won the 2017 Australian International Women's Weightlifting 90 kg and over division, and the transgender woman Hannah Mountsie competed in the AFL Victoria's Women's League. This is, so far as it stands, why I believe it is unfair to allow transgender women to compete against biological women.
What's interesting about the Rachel McKinnon case is the fact that the person responsible for attacking her, Wagner Asali, who came third, beat McKinnon in 10 out of 12 previous events. And not only did Asali fail to raise issue during those times, but apparently those 10 times can be ignored since McKinnon won the 2018 UCI Track Championship. The implication here being that a trans woman competing isn't a problem, just so long as she never wins. As for Laurel Hubbard, the event she holds her record in is divided by body weight. On top of that, her testosterone and therefore subsequent muscle mass are within IOC regulatory limits which, as noted earlier, many cis women go well and truly over. On top of this, whilst Hubbard holds the snatch record, she does not hold the clean and jerk record or the total record for her category. That belongs to Samoan weightlifter Ellie Epiloge. I also feel it right to note that last year, Hubbard dislocated her arm and completely ruptured a ligament, forcing her to withdraw. Now, one of the interesting things about Woodford's video is the fact that in spite of Hubbard only having set a single record as a trans woman, Woodford ends his video with this clip from Rogan.
There was this Australian weightlifter who's a trans woman who's competing as a woman and is fucking breaking records left and right. And everybody's like, this is crazy. She's an inspiration. Yeah. No, she's a guy. She used to be a guy, and now she's breaking these women's records. Like, what are we doing? This is crazy.
Yeah.
That's the last thought Woodford chose to end his video on. The message he wanted his viewers to leave his video with fresh in their minds. An active lie by Joe Rogan. And whilst Woodford never stated said lie himself, it is his video, his duty to verify what it is the sources he is using assert about the cases he falls back on. But moving on to Hannah Mounsey, I never got the issue with this one. Hannah Mounsey plays a team sport in which an array of body configurations are required. Also, once you introduce the team element, tactical play far outstrips personal ability. Also, she's been on the losing team before, so it's not like her presence guarantees victory. So what is this supposed to be evidence of?
This is Selena Sol. She's 16 years old, is 5'6", weighs 115 pounds, and she's damn fast. She recently ran the SEAC Women's 55-metre dash in just 7.36 seconds. But because Terry Miller and Andrea Yearwood, who are both transgender women, so easily took first and second place, Selena was eliminated. The story made national headlines after Selena's mother made a formal complaint, and since then Selena has had to bravely explain why she feels cheated to countless news networks and critics.
I have no problem with them being a girl and wanting to be a girl. My issue is with CAC. So the top 6 spots qualify for the New England meet, and I came in 8th place, and the 2 transgender athletes came 1 and 2. So if they weren't there, then my friend and I from another school would have been in those 2 spots and would have qualified.
And so here we have a very real example of a young, talented woman losing a potential scholarship and career due to this issue.
How does this personally affect you?
It personally affects me because I missed out on qualifying for further meets and showing off what I can do in front of college coaches and furthering my career in track.
What's really interesting to note here is that the CIAC rules stipulate that a student is entitled to participate as their gender without medical transition. And yet, in spite of that, both Miller and Yearwood are undergoing HRT. A fact I think rather clearly shows us that people are not gaming the system. They're not seeking unfair advantage. They're competing as women solely for the fact that they are women. I'm also rather disgusted by Woodford's attempts to paint Sol as some noble victim speaking out. The way he frames her as this fast and talented cis woman having a scholarship and career taken from her by trans people works twofold. It humanizes Sol to make you more sympathetic towards her, whilst dehumanizing both Miller and Yearwood. It's the same sort of rhetoric used when someone goes, "Those foreigners are coming in and stealing our jobs." It presupposes that Sol was owed the position, meanwhile Miller and Yearwood claimed it by unjust means. It's a very powerful emotional tool, though it has no actual merit. Thing is, Woodford's own argument can be used against him. Miller beat Sol by 0.37 seconds, yet Miller's own time was still 0.35 seconds slower than the current women's record, which stands at 6.65 seconds. Does that then mean that cis women have clear advantage over trans women? Now we actually have some data on trans athletes, specifically trans women runners. What's interesting is their model. Not only do they factor for known differences between cis men and women, they also factored in age grading. What they found was when these things were taken into consideration, whilst their overall performance decreased during HRT, their graded performance actually remained consistent. That's to say that if they were in the top 10% yet below the top 5% of male runners before transitioning, they'd find themselves in the same position of female runners at that age after transitioning. A quick note about the limitations of said study: the sample size is small and it did look predominantly at long distance runners. The sample size is of course the result of a small number of instances being available for review, however it still offers some basis for discussion, far more than the pure speculation used by Woodford and many others.
Okay, so let's get to the crux already. Why are transgender women allowed to compete against biological women? Well, there seems to be 3 primary arguments, and in response to peers bringing up Selena's situation, the sociologist Ellis Cashmore gave one of them.
The girl who came 8th lost out on qualifying for the state finals and a potential $200,000 scholarship because the two winners were transgender women who were just built so powerfully and were so fast, she didn't have a chance.
And
that cannot be fair.
I'm not suggesting that there is an easy solution.
What
to
is the
this.
solution then?
I think we have to embrace inclusivity.
What does that mean?
What that means is
about
that the person.
At the end of the day,
what
the spirit of sport.
You can say all these things, Ellis, but what does it actually mean?
Let me answer the question then. Be silent. Inclusivity means that we assign the person to whatever event their present-day sex suggests they should compete in.
Okay.
So there's the first argument. Ellis and other proponents assert that people should compete as whatever their present-day sex is, which is to say, whatever they personally or the public at large consider them to be. As if we're talking chromosomes here, then newsflash, they don't change.
Or he's referring to the testosterone levels as you go on to discuss in the second argument, the counter to which has already been refuted here. I didn't hear him specify identity or public opinion, I heard him refer to the current sex, which includes hormone levels, and his usage of the word suggests rather than states supports that. So it seems that you've taken that and changed it to better suit the narrative of emotionally driven irrational SJWs. In effect, a straw man. Also, chromosomes are not the only sexual characteristic, nor are they the one typically used to assign gender. We don't carry out genetic tests of every child born to assign them male or female, we look at other visible characteristics and make assumptions from there. And many times, those assumptions are incorrect. And I'm not on about transgender people. I am of course referring to the 2% of people who would be classed as intersex. Many of them pass under the radar completely undetected until much later in life, may die without ever even knowing. After all, it is possible for people with mosaic XY karyotypes to give birth to multiple children. Also, here's a fact to consider. Along with hormones, gametes, genitalia, internal structure and chromosomes, the brain should be considered in sex determination. After all, trans people have visible physiological reactions to being forced to adhere to the wrong gender, much like a gay person being forced to deny their sexuality. We also see the same in cis people who have been reassigned as infants following such things as botched circumcisions. Please look up the case of David Reamer. Now, if there's a psychological element which dictates gender, surely that element is entirely grounded in the physical brain and thus should be considered a part of a person's biological, aka physical, sex. This is why I disagree with people who attempt to separate sex and gender. You can't talk about gender without discussing sex, since gender is entirely grounded in sex. That is, unless Woodford would like to argue that the brain is not physical and is in fact host to a supernatural element such as a soul. In which case, I imagine many of his fans would eat him alive. The point I'm trying to make is we could in theory consider trans people intersex. At which point return to the United Nations Human Rights Council article referenced at the start.
Now, to put it succinctly, this argument commits either an appeal to emotion or an appeal to popularity fallacy. If the proponents are saying that it should depend on an individual's feelings, then it's the former, and if they're saying that it should depend on public opinion, then it's the latter. In any case, notice that they're not offering a reason as to why it's fair to allow transgender women to compete against biological women.
We assign the person to whatever event their present-day sex suggests they should compete in.
Okay.
Now, putting aside the fact that public opinion varies significantly from country to country, we can expose the fallacious nature of this argument by applying one of my all-time favourite techniques, the reductio ad absurdum. If the majority believed that age was just a cultural construct, would this make it fair for Thor Bjornsson to compete as a senior? No. If the majority believed that weight categories are fat-shaming, would that make it fair for Anthony Joshua to compete as a featherweight? No, of course not. Or put it this way, the majority once believed that atheists, such as I, should be burnt at the stake, but that didn't make it fair, right, or logical, did it? Now, to be fair, this is the weakest of the three primary arguments, but it is indeed popular enough to warrant this response. And so now that we've consumed the lowest hanging fruit, let's go for the highest.
Isn't it funny how you presented these as the only two options, and yet my previous response fell into neither? However, I do want to note a few of the weaknesses with the assertions made here. Notions of sport and fairness are socially constructed. Yes, they should be guided by evidence, something I wish you yourself adhered to. But ultimately, It will come down to personal values. Do you value the rights of trans women or the personal feelings of those prejudiced against them? I also see a great deal of irony in your usage of burning people at the stake. Trans people face constant abuse and stigma for the very same reason that non-believers do. They're entirely misunderstood and their existence challenges presuppositional truths that people have become so used to swallowing. That's why the current scientific consensus stands with trans people in the authenticity of their existence. So with that noted, let's move on to the third and final point in Woodford's video.
And finally, the third most prominent argument given, and one that was also voiced by Ellis to Piers and Susan, is that sport has never been equal. Now, while I disagree with this argument, I personally find it to be the most compelling, as it's true. Nature endows her gifts unevenly, and so there's no such thing as a truly level playing field. But what do we do about this? We could, as many proponents suggest, make all sports and athletics mixed gender. But if we did this, then we can kiss goodbye to the vast majority of female athletes. Within the athletic world, it's a well-known fact that in most events, men simply outperform women by a margin of roughly 10%, and in events that are strength-based, the margin is significantly greater. Ryan Kennelly's world record bench press, for example, is over double that of Becca Swanson's.
What really bugs me about this is the fact that Woodford presents this as the only solution forwarded. Meanwhile, I can think of a variety of less extreme alternatives. For example, you could just allow trans women to compete in women's sports. We don't have to make sports mixed gender to do that. We could just accept trans women as they are, as we should with intersex cis women. And to that end, I'd just like to note the fact that the Olympics has allowed trans women to compete since 2004. That's 15 years of trans women being allowed to compete at the Olympic level. And in spite of all of this, trans women have not come to dominate said games. Now this tells us two important things. For a start, it tells us a lot about claims such as these.
And I'm convinced that unless quickly rectified, this will kill women's sport. I don't want to see the day when women's athletics is dominated by Y chromosomes, but without a change in policy, that is precisely what's going to happen.
In effect, the Olympics have been a testing ground for Woodford's claims for the past 15 years, and we've not seen anything to remotely support the alarmist spiel he throws out there. This is the exact same rhetoric as that used by apologists who claim that high levels of atheism in a country lead to its destruction. And just as they ignore the existence of countries such as Sweden, Woodford has to ignore the evidence of the Olympics. What it also confirms indirectly is that there's no evidence to support the belief that trans women will outcompete cis women in sport. Now, how can I tell that? Nations are willing to pour millions of dollars into Olympic teams for the chance to win gold medals, and they'll do their research to figure out the easiest way to maximize that. So if there were strong evidence that trans women had a clear advantage over cis women, it would be very reasonable to expect nations to start hunting for trans athletes. Not for the benefit of said athletes, but to ensure the best shot at gold in the Olympics to uphold a capitalistic sense of national pride. But that doesn't happen. There are next to no trans Olympians, let alone any all-trans lineups. Another thing we could do is extend women's categories in weighted sports. One thing I notice is that the weight categories for women in the Gold Coast Weightlifting Championship peaks at 90 kg plus. Meanwhile, the men's goes on to peak at 105 kg plus. Now both cis women Ellie Epiloge and trans woman Laurel Hubbard have body weights over 125 kg. So perhaps they should be competing in a woman's 105 kg plus category. Another solution could be mathematics. If further study shows trans women to have an advantage over cis women in certain sports, given time, we could develop a model to extract just how much of an advantage it really is. And much like age grading, we could in theory use that to calculate a neutral result that would allow trans women to compete as women without having to worry about unfair advantage. Note, I'm not forwarding any of these as the solution. I'm merely pointing out that it's dishonest of you to pretend like there's only one outcome. But no matter what, just as with intersex cis women, trans women should be allowed to compete in women's sports. Why? Because assigned gender aside, they are women. They have as much right to compete as any cis woman out there.
What's more, if we're going to have mixed gender competition, then why not also have mixed age? I mean, nature endows her gifts unevenly, right? Some people develop quicker than others, and so let's do away with age restrictions and have Thor compete as a senior. And while we're at it, let's dispose of weight categories too, because some people have heavier bones, a wider frame, and retain more water weight than others. You see, when taken to its logical conclusion, this solution produces absurd results. We have to draw the line somewhere.
There's no, even playing field. There's nothing you do about that. But one thing we can do is we can keep women from getting beaten up by men.
Anyhow, that's why I'm opposed to allowing transgender women to compete against biological women. The arguments offered are based on emotion and politics, are scientifically and logically erroneous, or, when taken to their logical conclusion, produce absurd and unworkable outcomes.
Says the person ending on a slippery slope fallacy. After all, if we're going to allow men to marry men and women to marry women, we may as well allow men to marry children or women to marry dogs. And I agree. We have to draw the line somewhere. For marriage and love, it is of course informed consent. For trans athletes, it's their human rights. The same rights as those listed for intersex cis women at the very start of this video. Again, we have 15 years of trans women being allowed to compete in female categories at the Olympics. Yet we have absolutely no evidence of what you claim will happen unless we act quickly. And there's certainly none of that supplied throughout your video. All you did supply was evidence for the differences between cis men and cis women, a few misframed case studies, and throughout a string of alarmist dog whistles for certain segments of your audience. Now, part of my mind keeps going back to Woodford's portrayal of Miller and Yearwood's wins. The way that he portrayed Soul as this victim who had her dreams, her hard work, her scholarship, and her career being dashed against the rocks. As if Miller and Yearwood, and by implication all trans people, don't have dreams and aspirations of their own. It's completely dehumanizing, and it's the standard for discourse about trans people. It echoes what I've been told as a bisexual person, that my love is not genuine, that it's lesser. And yeah, that shit hurts. And you can say that's my emotion speaking, but when discussing a sense of fairness, emotion will play a part. That's how said sense of fairness evolved. By pretending to be someone completely void of emotional bias rather than acknowledging your emotions and accounting for them, all you've done is let those very emotions dictate your position, to the point that rather than study the topic in depth and letting the evidence speak for itself, you scramble to parrot anything that matches your predetermined conclusion. And that's just not acceptable. But what do you guys think? Did Woodford fail to meet a basic standard of research for his video? Did anything he forward offer justification to deny trans people their rights? Do you lot think that the vast majority of complaints about trans women winning one or two sports events is simply bad sportsmanship? Did I miss something you noticed? If so, be sure to comment down below. As always, I'll link a couple of my other videos at the end of this one. You can also support us on Patreon. We are trying to make the channel ad-free, so be sure to check that out. I'd also like to say a big thank you to all our Patreon sponsors for making what we do possible. Though a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Brad R, Muck Gay, John Schoenrock, Evan Heinberg, Daniel Martinez, Alexander Williams, and Atlas5. Take care now, and I'll see you next time.